Chapter 13 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. Part 2. The Character of Judaic Christianity. 137. In describing the early expansion of Christianity, we have noted something of its progress among the Jews. We have seen that the dispersion of the disciples carried the faith among the scattered Hebrew communities, especially those in Syria, and that in Judea, after the cessation of the first persecution, the number of believers steadily increased. We have noted also their gradual separation from the synagogue and the establishment of churches modeled substantially after the synagogal system. We have further observed the sympathy of the Mother Church with the work among the Gentiles. The latter fact is attested not only in the Acts, but by Paul himself. He distinctly states that while he was laboring in Cilicia, the churches of Judea heard of his activity and glorified God in him. Galatians 1, verse 24. 138. Yet it would appear that the progress of Judaic Christianity was rather external than internal. Its loyalty to the Mosaic system and its natural satisfaction with the forms in which religious truth had been presented by Mosaicism kept it theologically stagnant. It is probable that most of the Jewish Christians reconciled themselves at this period to the fellowship of uncircumcised Gentiles by regarding them as the Gentile adherents of Judaism itself were regarded, and the spread of Judaism among the Gentiles was so marked a feature of the age that the adhesion of the latter to the new faith without receiving circumcision seemed less perilous to Jewish institutions than it appeared later. Certainly no conflict on the subject had yet arisen. Judaic Christianity at this period may be likened to the course of a stream which is spread out upon a meadow, destined indeed to be carried into the rushing torrent further on, but as yet only slightly moved by the current. It presents, therefore, a particularly interesting study. 139. After the Herodian persecution, A.D. 44, the most conspicuous individual among the Palestinian Christians was James, the Lord's brother. Galatians 1, verse 19. Compare Galatians 2, verse 9, Acts 12, verse 17, Acts 15, verse 13, Acts 21, verse 18, Matthew 13, verse 55, Mark 6, verse 3. He is not to be identified with the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, for the brethren of the Lord are distinguished by the evangelists from the apostles. Matthew 12, verse 46, John 7, verses 3 and 5, Acts 1, verse 14. Paul's language, Galatians 1, verse 19, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, has indeed been thought to imply that James was an apostle, and the hypothesis has been advanced that after the death of James, son of Zebedee, Acts 12, verse 2, the brother of the Lord was chosen to fill his place. Others think that in these passages Paul, contrary to his usual custom, uses the term apostle in a loose sense. But his language does not compel either of these interpretations. That in Galatians 1, verse 19, James is not necessarily to be included among the apostles is shown by the example of other sentences similarly constructed. For instance, Romans 14, verse 14, Luke 4, verse 26. While in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, the order of words in the original would seem to imply that James is rather distinguished from than included among them. As already observed also, it is questionable whether he was meant to be included among the apostles by Luke in Acts 9, verse 27, section 94. Certainly, apart from these very doubtful instances, he is not called an apostle, and, what is most significant, he does not so call himself in his epistle. It is more likely that after the apostolate had been delocalized by the progress of the organization of the Judean churches, section 103, James, who remained in Jerusalem, became the practical leader of the Jewish Christians, and this leadership, on account of his personal character and high spiritual gifts, rather than because of any office held by him, became so marked that he exerted an influence equal to that of the apostles themselves. Galatians 2, verse 9. And was remembered in after times as the head of the Mother Church. 140. At any rate, The prominence and influence of James is beyond dispute. Peter, when fleeing from imprisonment, sent word of his escape to James and the brethren, Acts 12, verse 17. At the Council of Jerusalem, James' opinion had decisive weight, Acts 15, verses 12 through 21. It was certain from James, whose presence at Antioch led Peter to withdraw from fellowship with Gentiles, Galatians 2, verse 12. On Paul's final return to Jerusalem, it was James and the elders who received him, Acts 21, verse 18. The Epistle of James witnesses to the authority and wide influence of its writer, and the author of Jude introduced himself to his readers as the brother of James, Jude 1. To this may be added the testimony of secular history and tradition. Josephus relates that after the recall of Festus, AD 62, the high priest Annas secured the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, and of some others, on the ground that they had broken the law, but that the better citizens complained of the act, so that, in consequence, Annas was removed from office by Agrippa II. The respect in which James was held by the whole city is also attested by tradition. Hegesippus relates that he was known as the Just, and as the bulwark of the people, that he lived the life of a Nazarite, that he had a high reputation for piety of a rather ascetic type. Hegesippus' account contains some fanciful features, and his narrative of James' death, in which the Lord's brother is said to have been cast by the Jews from the roof of the temple, then stoned, and finally beaten on the head, bears traces of considerable legendary embellishment, and is a less probable account than that given by Josephus. But the evidence, wherever we find it, discloses a man of large influence, impressive character, and intense piety, according to the finest Hebrew ideals, one, therefore, most likely to attain leadership among the Jewish disciples. 141. In order to form a still clearer image of James, we must go back to the Nazarene home in which Jesus was reared. The brethren of the Lord were either the children of Joseph by a former marriage, or the children of Joseph and Mary born after Jesus. The latter view seems best to accord with the intimations of the Gospels. The view advanced by Jerome, and elaborated by others, that they were the cousins of Jesus on his mother's side, is beset with difficulties, of which it is sufficient to mention the fact that it identifies James with the son of Alphaeus, and so makes him one of the original apostles. This is still less foundation for the view that they were the cousins of Jesus on Joseph's side. In any event, James has been the daily associate of Jesus in the Nazarene home. We infer that from early life he had been an earnest religious character, steeped in the teaching of the Old Testament and in later Hebrew literature. The tradition of his devoted piety can hardly have been without some foundation. His knowledge of Greek, on the other hand, is explained by the bilingual character of Jewish society, especially in the region of the Sea of Galilee. Yet, with all his piety, James did not accept Jesus as Messiah. This does not exclude, however, sympathy with much of Jesus' teaching, nor warm affection for his person. His unbelief may have been due to Jesus' rupture with many Jewish conventionalities, also to James' exalted view of the glory of the Messiah, and the impression of Jesus' lowliness produced on one who had himself shared it. The fact that Jesus, after his resurrection, appeared to James, 1 Corinthians 15:7, is a testimony to the latter's high character, as well as to his brother's love for him and foresight of his future usefulness. 142. We cannot wonder, then, that when convinced of the messiahship of his former brother, but now risen Lord, James soon ranked high in the new community. It is not clear what office he occupied in the Jerusalem church. Later tradition made him its first bishop, chosen to that office by the apostles, and among extreme Jewish Christians of the 2nd century he was represented as the bishop of the entire church. But these traditions read back later ideas into the Apostolic Age. He was doubtless one of the elders of the church, and if the eldership of Jerusalem had a permanent president, of which there is no proof, James presumably held that office. It is more probable, however, that his influence was personal rather than official. His relation to Jesus naturally enhanced it. He was clearly the man to lead the Jewish believers. Devoted to the ritual law, he interpreted it in the spirit of Jesus. A thorough Jew, he was not a formalist. Amid the general hostility to the church, he gave the cause reputation even with unbelievers. In the political and civil excitements of the time, he kept the disciples' thoughts fixed on the true service and on the duty of patiently waiting for Messiah's return. He was thus quite as truly fitted to his situation as Paul was to the work of preaching to the Gentiles. 143. These remarks are justified by the Epistle of James, which is the historic monument of early Judaic Christianity. It is addressed to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. This phrase might have been used of Christians generally, compare 1 Peter 1 verse 1, but, in the absence of other indications, naturally describes Jews, compare Acts 26 verse 7, who, in their Christian wanderings, realized afresh the dispersion of Israel. The phrase is thus well satisfied if we suppose that the Jewish believers scattered throughout Syria, and perhaps not excluding Palestine, since the church as a whole was in a state of dispersion, were especially in mind, for certainly the readers were Christians. James 2 verse 1, yet into their synagogue an unbelieving Jew might come. James 2 verses 2 through 6. And in verses 1 through 6, the writer utters an invective against the rich, which is plainly directed against Jewish oppressors of the poor. In chapter 3, verses 9 through 12, and chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Also, while believers are included in the reproofs, they are represented as liable to sins which are particularly characteristic of their compatriots. The external situation of the readers thus corresponds with that mixed condition of believing and unbelieving Jews which we have found existing during the early spread of the faith among the Jews of Syria. 144. The epistle itself is an earnest homily. It begins with an exhortation to joy amid trial because of its spiritual discipline. James 1 verses 2 through 4. Wisdom to live aright can surely be obtained from God. James 1 verse 5. But steadfast faith is the keynote of the true religious life. James 1 verses 6 through 8. Outward circumstances are nothing in comparison with spiritual realities. James 1 verses 9 through 11. God is the giver of all good, and in joy of a spiritual quickening through the word of truth, and in the sense of deliverance from indwelling sin, which is the cause of spiritual death, his children are hopefully to trust him. James 1 verses 12 through 18. Obedience also is the true worship. Hence, they must seek to work out in life God's own righteousness. James 1 verses 19 through 20. This can only be done by the real reception of his revealed word into the heart. James 1 verse 21. Christian life is not one of slavery to precepts, but looking into the perfect law of liberty, believers are to bring forth the true religious service of benevolence and holiness. James 1 verses 22 through 27. The author then rebukes in turn certain faults to which his readers were liable, and which, it should be noted, were just those into which Jewish Christians were likely to fall. These are 1. The over-evaluation of riches and rich men, James 2 verses 1 through 13. 2. Reliance on a merely formal, intellectual faith, James 2 verses 14 through 26. 3. Pride in knowledge and in the position of being teachers of others, section 3. 4. Absorption in civil and political strife to the injury of religious interests, James 4 verses 1 through 12. 5. Undue devotion to worldly business, an evil which is signally illustrated by the frequent oppression of the poor by the rich, James 4 verse 13 to 5 verse 8. Exhortations to patience, against swearing, to prayer, and the conversion of sinners bring the epistle to its close. James 5 verses 9 through 20. The work is saturated with Old Testament language and allusions. though it contains but 4 formal quotations: James 2, verses 4 and 23, James 4, verses 5 and 6. It also betrays familiarity with the wisdom literature of the post-canonical period. For example, James chapter 1, verses 5 and 15, James chapter 3, verse 2, with Ecclesiasticus chapter 41, verse 22, Ecclesiasticus chapter 5, verse 11, Ecclesiasticus chapter 19, verse 6, Ecclesiasticus chapter 28, verses 13 through 26, and James chapter 4, verse 14, James chapter 5, verse 6, with Wisdom of Solomon chapter 2, verse 5, and verses 12 through 20. 145. This conception of Christianity is what we would expect from the brother of Jesus. His ideal of life is the real working out of God's righteousness, the true performance of the divine will. James 1, verse 20. Compare Matthew 6, verse 33. He regards the law not as a collection of disjointed precepts, but as the revelation of a principle whereby we live in harmony with God. James 2, verse 10. It is to be interpreted, therefore, with a view to its deep spiritual content. James 1, verse 22, James 2, verse 8. By the law, however, he means not only the Old Testament, but this as completed by a new revelation which the Christian has received. James 1, verses 18, 21, and 22. Obedience also consists in the free service of love. James 1, verse 25. James' position, therefore, corresponds closely with that of our Lord in the Sermon on the Mount. In neither case was it the object to exhibit the way of salvation, but to show how a saved man should live. Hence, a reason why James says so little of Christ, and nothing of the stirring events of his career, which all his readers knew, though the titles Lord and Lord of Glory are enough to indicate his belief in Jesus as one sent from heaven, the exalted Messiah, and the revealer of the Father. To him, we may believe, the method of salvation lay sufficiently disclosed in the temple ritual, to which he and his readers were loyal. Their faith in Jesus as their Savior and Lord lay side by side with their use of the appointed sacrifices, without their realizing as yet the full relation of the two. What most impressed them was the fact that God had quickened them by the crowning revelation of His will. The former Judaism had blossomed into a spiritual life of love and holiness through the teaching of Jesus and their faith in Him as Messiah. Into the full joy of this rich experience, James would lead them, and in so doing, he reflects that side of the teaching of Jesus which would naturally impress an earnest Jew. Meanwhile, he realized that the existing state of things was temporary. Not yet had the promises of glory been fulfilled. The return of Christ is therefore emphasized for the encouragement of his suffering disciples, James 5, verses 7, 8, and 9, and for a warning to sinners, James 2, verse 12, James 4, verse 12. James thus sounds the notes of faith, spiritual service, and patient endurance which were most needful to the scattered Hebrew disciples, and his emphasis on these in the circumstances evinces a profound appreciation of the teaching of the Master. 146. This epistle, therefore, illuminates the early period of Judaic Christianity. The impulse to dogmatic development did not as yet exist. It needed the outbreak of controversy. There must have been much that these Jewish believers could not understand. What was to be the ultimate relation of their faith to Judaism? What should be their attitude to national politics? In what way would their Messiah vindicate his claims? The answers to these problems must have been quite obscure. Their religion comprised faith in Jesus as Messiah, the spiritual interpretation of the divine law as he had elucidated it, the cultivation of the love and holiness which he had exhibited and commanded, the actual enjoyment of reconciliation with God through faith in Christ, the consciousness of a new life bestowed by God, the confident expectation of Christ's return in glory to make all things right. These are the main features of Christian life revealed to us by James. His epistle reflects a period of transition. It shows also the Christian life was not being fed by current Jewish thought, for there is not a trace in it of national hope or of apocalyptic fancies, but by the Old Testament, the teaching of Jesus, and the leading of the Spirit. James 4, verse 5. Thus, side by side with Judaism, reverencing the law and worshiping in the temple, forming its own synagogues, but not breaking with the national life, Judaic Christianity strove to appropriate the message of Jesus and to await his return. It was a condition of things which could not long remain. The expansion of Christianity and the fall of Jerusalem were destined soon to disturb it. Yet quite as certainly was it a condition which must have existed among the Jewish believers at this period of the history. End of section 13.